welcome back to Food Prep Guide. I am finally bringing y'all the all things tomato preservation video that I have been promising you for a while now. When it comes to tomatoes from the garden, as they come in, I just throw them in the freezer to deal with later when things aren't so crazy and hectic during the garden season. So fall, very early fall is usually when I can really get into the tomato preservation without it being so crazy and hectic on my schedule in the summer when I have so many crops coming in at one time. So the tips I'm going to be sharing with you today, the clips that you're going to be seeing today, all of them are going to be starting from frozen tomatoes, and that's why. And before we dig into the video, I wanted to quickly discuss something that could be confusing, and that is I have like a big tomato preservation weekends where I try to get multiple products out of one batch or one harvest of tomatoes. So I'm going to be sharing all of those tips with y'all today in this video, but I will process my tomatoes two different ways depending on what my needs are at the time. And you're going to be seeing both of those ways in this video. And I feel like it could be confusing, like, you know, I show you one way and then you're seeing a completely different way, and you might wonder why are you doing things totally differently now? So I wanted to quickly explain that. The very first way, the method that I'm going to show you, is when my only goal is to get as much spaghetti sauce and tomato sauce in my pantry as possible, because I'm not trying to get tomato juice and tomato powder and, you know, all those other types of things out of the tomatoes. I want them all going into our spaghetti sauce because it takes a lot of tomatoes to make spaghetti sauce. So when I am the very first round of tomato processing that I do, my sole focus is getting as many quart jars of sauce on my shelf as possible. And in order to do that, I need to process them in a certain way that will give me higher yields of finished product. So that's the process that you're going to see first. After I am happy with the amount of quart jars of spaghetti sauce or just tomato sauce that I have on my shelf, then I will switch to the second method of preservation, where I am trying to get tomato sauce, tomato juice, and tomato powder out of the same batch of tomatoes. The reason why I don't do that method for when I'm doing sauce is because it decreases how much sauce I end up with when I'm trying to save some for juice and save some for tomato powder and all of that. So I hope that kind of clarifies why you will see two totally different processes in this video. One is to maximize your yields of sauce, and the other is to maximize how many different types of preserves you can get from one batch of tomatoes. So hope that kind of clarifies. Hope I didn't confuse anybody by that. Okay, let's go ahead and hop into it. If you would like help mastering tomatoes from seed to table, we do have a Sprout to Supper Guide Tomato Edition available on our website. It is an 80-page guide complete with a video library that walks you all the way through from the very beginning, from seed starting to planting, growing, harvesting, preserving, and more, including recipes for serving it at your table. If you're interested, that link will be down in the description box below, labeled Tomatoes, a Sprout to Supper Guide. You click that link and it will take you straight to our website. If you're new here, we invite you to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming tutorials on gardening, food preservation, food storage, and more. Like I mentioned, I'm going to start off showing you how I process tomatoes when my sole focus is putting up our tomato sauce / spaghetti sauce. I use those words interchangeably because that's just how we use it, is mostly for pasta sauce, but anytime a recipe calls for tomato sauce, I will use this recipe. It is basically a tomato basil sauce with just a little bit of garlic and onion in it. It is loosely based off of a Ball's basil garlic tomato sauce. And I will explain to you why I mean loosely. I like to flavor it with red wine vinegar, which I'll show you in a minute, and we'll talk more about that in depth when it's time to add that and why I am adding it. So I use my oven roaster, and that is how I process a lot of tomatoes at once. This is 5 gallons of tomatoes that we're going to be processing at one time. I could probably fit 6 gallons of tomatoes in there because as they heat up and as they start kind of losing their liquid and letting out their liquid, the volume of those tomatoes really decrease. But 5 gallons fits pretty comfortably in this countertop roaster oven. And I will just start out with dumping all the tomatoes in the bag, and I don't put any water in the bottom, and there's 2 ways you can do this. You can start out with just a little bit of splash of water in the bottom of your oven roaster to prevent scorching or burning. But I prefer to not water down my tomato sauce any more than it's already going to be watered down. So I choose to skip that step, and instead, what I will do is start off with a very low temperature on my roaster oven. It's going to be somewhere in the 200 degrees Fahrenheit range. And then only after that it has released some liquid and I can verify that there's enough liquid in there that it's not going to scorch the bottom of the oven roaster. As you can see, there's plenty of liquid down there in the bottom. I'm not worried anymore about burning. And so at that point, I will go ahead and turn it up to the temperature that it will remain at for the remaining length of time that it's cooking. And that is 300 degrees Fahrenheit. You can go all the way up to 350 degrees Fahrenheit if you want to. I generally keep it at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And the process is simply every hour or 2 hours, I lift the lid, I stir it, and I just continue this whole process all throughout the day until it gets to the point where there's really not like any telltale sign that says, I'm ready for ingredients. It's just you do what you want to do. But you can see the consistency of the tomatoes here when I add my first ingredient, and that is 1 cup of chopped onions. You can see they're very nice and liquidy. I have not run the blender through this at all. So this is just strictly tomatoes cooked down, have not been blended whatsoever. I think I forgot to film the clip of adding the garlic, and I think I added the garlic first. And I used 3 tablespoons of minced garlic in this recipe. That's to 5 gallons of tomatoes. This is one of the tricks I use to thicken up my tomato sauce without having to thaw and strain off the liquid and without having to cook it down and simmer it down for an extremely long time. This is also how I increase my yields. Like I said, it takes a lot of tomato sauce or tomatoes to make tomato sauce, and adding tomato paste is one way that you can increase the volume of sauce that you end up with. For 5 gallons of tomatoes, I will add 5 to 6 little jars of tomato paste. Next is basil. I will use a 1/2 cup to 1 cup of basil. When I first started making this recipe, I went ahead and minced it up in my processor and put it in there. But now now I've realized, why am I doing this extra step of mincing up the garlic first when I'm going to be using my immersion blender anyway? So now I just throw that fresh basil right in there and then do the blending process before moving forward with the rest of the ingredients. And that's because the rest of the ingredients are simply seasonings in the red wine vinegar. Everything that's in the pot right now is everything that really needs to be blended up into a finer consistency. The tomatoes, the onions, the garlic, and the basil. I highly recommend an immersion blender. It makes my tomato processing day go so much quicker. I will have one linked in the description box below for anyone who is interested. I will note that when you are blending your tomatoes like this, whether it's with an immersion blender or a regular blender, you are putting air pockets into your sauce. So it is completely common to find little air bubbles in your tomato sauce, in the jars, in the finished product, and that can be worrisome. Whoops. That can be worrisome to some people because, bubbles is often a sign that food has spoiled, but I will show you exactly what that looks like at the end of this video and what those safe bubbles look like. So now we're ready for our seasonings, and first is going to be salt. I use 2 tablespoons of canning salt. This is just simply sea salt has not been iodized and doesn't have any anti-caking agents in it. Next is the red wine vinegar. This is where I stray a little bit from Ball's recipe, but this straying or this change doesn't it doesn't lower the acidity level. In fact, it increases the acidity level. So I have nothing to worry about here. And I add red wine vinegar because I feel like it adds such wonderful flavor to the tomato sauce. I have made tomato sauce for years and it always seemed to be lacking something like a zing or like a deeper flavor. And so last year I kind of experimented with different types of ingredients and I nailed it with the red wine vinegar. And now that red wine vinegar will be in my sauce from now on. So the next ingredient is going to be Italian seasoning. You can certainly skip this if you like. This is not going to affect the safety of your recipe as long as you're using dried seasonings. You can use whatever you want here. I am using 1 tablespoon of Italian seasonings. Now, what I have here is pH strips, and that's because I want to know the acidity of this batch of tomato sauce. Tomatoes vary wildly in their acidity levels. And I want to water bath can my sauce. So that means 2 things. That means I need to be careful with how much low acid ingredients I add, and you could see that I added very, very little onions and garlic compared to the massive amount of tomatoes I had. But I also need to verify that the tomatoes I used in this particular batch were indeed acidic enough to be water bath canned. But remember, we also added that red wine vinegar. You can see it measures right in between, right at 4.0, in between 3.5 and 4.0. And as long as it is numerically below 4.6, we are good to go to water bath can safely. Now, I will, even though I'm following this same recipe, every time I can each year, I use the pH strips because of how wildly tomatoes vary in their acidity, and I don't want to guess. I want to know, and I want to know for sure that that recipe is acidic enough to be water bath canned. Can you pressure can tomato sauce? Absolutely, and I have in the past, but I find that it gives it kind of almost like an overcooked, slightly burnt taste. Maybe that's just me and my taste buds, but that's just how it has been with pressure canning. And so one of the benefits of adding the red wine vinegar, not just for flavor, but it also increases the acidity and allows me to safely water bath can this delicious tomato basil garlic sauce. Another tip I want to note when we get to the canning process, you normally see me use my basket, but I don't with this recipe. I use just a pressure canner rack on the bottom to protect the jars because I can fit more quart jars in my canner that way. When you use a basket, you can't fit quite as much in there. So that's just one tip. As always, when we are water bath canning, the water level needs to be submerged by submerging those jars by at least an inch, if not closer to 2 inches. And we don't start our processing time until we are at a hard rolling boil. And this recipe needs to water bath can for 40 minutes. That's if you live at 1,000 feet elevation or below. If you live above 1,000 feet elevation, you will likely need to add time to this recipe, and you'll want to look that up for your elevation. So we ended up with, I don't even remember, this is only one batch. I think I did 3 or 4 of these loads. But I wanted to show you the separation here. That's completely normal, just the juice separating from the pulp, the more of the solids parts. That's completely normal. It doesn't affect the quality at all. You just shake your jars and it'll be fine. There's that bubble that I was mentioning. You can see those little bubbles all throughout here. Those are safe bubbles. Those are bubbles because they are stationary. They are not moving. If those bubbles were to be fizzing and rising to the top, those would be unsafe bubbles that would indicate some concerning things going on with your tomato sauce. But this is only happening because we blended up the tomatoes, so I wanted to give y'all a fair warning about that. Okay, now moving on to the second way that I will process tomatoes on my big batch days, and that is straining off the liquid and thawing the tomatoes first. So when we're focused on sauce, all of those frozen tomatoes go in the oven roaster. We want to capture all of that juice. We want to even keep some of that water. I mean, we want to really maximize our sauce yields, so I don't want to lose anything. But when I'm switching to the second way, once I've met my goals with sauce and I switch to this way, I'm okay with losing some of that juice because I want to can juice. I want to actually harvest the juice from the tomatoes. So one thing that's great about frozen tomatoes is that when they thaw, the skins slip right off, and that's wonderful because we're going to use those skins to create our tomato powder in just a minute. I have this soaked in water, but you don't even have to soak that in water. They come off just fine. But notice that as the tomatoes sit here, they're producing even more juice. So all of that juice is going to go into one pot eventually. I just pour everything into half gallon jars and stick them in the refrigerator until I have enough. There's even some juice coming out of these tomato peels. But I will just repeat this process until I have a good bit of juice and a good bit of tomato peels, and then move forward with canning up tomato juice. This year we ended up with 4 half gallons so I guess that's 2 gallons of tomato juice. And I will typically can these in quart jars, and sometimes I can them in pint jars just for drinking. I normally use these when I'm making chilies and soups, but some people just really like to drink the tomato juice, and so I will can those in pint jars for them. I mentioned how I save my tomato peels. I will put them in quart jars and stir and keep them in the refrigerator and until I have a big enough batch to fill up my dehydrator trays. So here I'm just putting them on my dehydrator trays. We don't this there's nothing super scientific about this. You just laying them out on your trays, making sure that there's not like a big tall thick layer. It's okay if they touch. You can see here I'm not worried about each individual peel touching each other. You just simply don't want to have a double layer of peels, or else it's going to take a very long time to dehydrate. And you run the risk of the kind of middle part not dehydrating while the outer parts get over dry. But once everything is laid out on my trays, I will put them in the dehydrator at 125 degrees Fahrenheit. As far as time goes, it's going to vary depending on the environment that you're in, and the humidity levels and all of that. So I hesitate to give you a time, but in general, around the 8-hour mark is when you want to start checking it. Most of the time, I prep my trays sometime in the afternoon and I just let it go overnight, and we'll take them out around 7 a.m. the next morning. So these could potentially go up to 12 hours, 10 hours, something like that. And that's always been fine for me to go ahead and just dehydrate them that way. So here they are the next day out of the dehydrator. They're nice and crispy, they're nice and flaky, and we are now ready to put them in our blender or coffee grinder or NutriBullet. Anything that you can get a powdered form out of, you can use to process these. I like to use my dry container. If you have a Vitamix, I highly recommend the dry container. It is an incredible food processing tool. It will take wheat berries and give you flour. That's how fine of a powder that you get with the dry container of the Vitamix blender. So if you have that, I highly recommend. I'll link it in the description box below. But you do need a lot of tomato skins to make tomato powder. So to meet our goals for the year for tomato powder, we will dehydrate and powder tomato sauce, and we have a whole video dedicated to showing you how to do that. And that's how I get up my higher volumes of sauce of tomato powder on my shelf. I hope that was helpful to y'all. That's all for today, and we will see you next time. Bye.